In a recent conversation with a few folks on the topic of how church is done, someone chimed in with this statement, and maybe you've heard it somewhere before. It's kind of one of those familiar truthisms. I think it's intended to be one of those mic drop moments or something. It went like this. Hey guys, as long as we all believe in Jesus, all the other stuff doesn't really matter. And I know that their intentions here were good, okay? This is supposed to mean that agreeing on the basics like Jesus' deity, his life, his death, and resurrection are the most important things. And I would agree that these are the most important things because without them, there is nothing else. But here's where I disagree. There is other stuff that matters. Yes, a Christless church is pointless, but a Christ-centered church has a purpose. And what is that purpose? 2 Corinthians 5:18 frames it so well. It says that God reconciled us to himself through Christ, and then he shared the ministry of reconciliation with us. Friends, being a church that carries forward the ministry of Jesus, it matters. So a while back, I was with a friend who heard a certain speaker say that the church is the hope of the world. And they were very quick to make a remark, no, Jesus is the hope of the world. And well, that is true. Guys, Jesus is the hope of the world. But you know what? Jesus has a body. And Jesus brings about hope to the world through his body. This stuff about the church matters because through Christ, we have been brought into a relationship. And in the context of that relationship, we, the church, have been entrusted with this wonderful responsibility. We are called to do what Jesus did. We are called to be restorers of relationship. We are called to be ministers of reconciliation. But let's freeze on that word ministers for just a minute. Immediately, I bet, minister brings to mind certain mental images, like we likely have a picture of a pastor or a preacher or the church staff. But I believe these associations have deep and inhibitive implications. Many of us have allowed ourselves to think that the church, reaching her potential, is dependent upon a select few people, the professionals, when in fact the church was intended by Christ to be a fully functioning body, a family on a mission, a united restorative force commissioned by Jesus to bring his kingdom reality into a broken world. But our often accepted clergy-laity distinctions stand in the way of all this. We end up with those who do ministry versus those who receive ministry. We end up with the purveyors of spiritual goods versus the consumers of spiritual goods. We have the shopkeepers and the shoppers, and then we end up inwardly focused and ineffective somehow. But my hope is to inspire a vision for a different kind of church entirely, for a true collective that isn't dependent on clergy to do the work of the ministry while the rest of us cheer them on from the sidelines. The church I see is one where every person is a minister. And through the course of this house group season, we're going to remove those two shaky pillars of clergy and laity that have so weakened our household of faith, and we're going to replace them with two other pillars firmly planted in our foundation. These two pillars are the priesthood of all believers and the gifts of the Spirit. And these aren't just concepts to us. They aren't just things that we should believe in theory with little to no effect on how we live our lives. What we'll learn here will have a tremendous impact on our reality. So stick with this, because I don't think that you're here on accident. So let's start with our first pillar, the priesthood of all believers. So what is this priesthood of all believers thing about anyway? Well, I think it's going to help us if we bring some simple historic context into the picture. You see, before Moses, the priestly order didn't even exist. But under the Old Covenant, God set aside the family of Levi, Moses' brother, to serve in a very specific way by caring for the tabernacle, what would later become the temple. It was Levi's 3 sons who were first given the distinction of being priests. And these Levites had a role to intercede on behalf of the people and to offer up sacrifices. Among the priests, only Aaron and then one of his sons was called the high priest and was allowed into the Holy of Holies once a year. Now, the Holy of Holies was where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and it was behind this thick veil that separated the people from the presence of God. But this was all just a dim shadow of what was to come. You see, this priesthood served as just a taste of the coming ministry of Jesus. So watch what happens during the crucifixion scene of Matthew 27. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Matthew 27, 50 through 51. When Jesus gave himself as a sacrifice for us, the veil that separated us from the presence of God in the Holy of Holies was ripped in half. God was revealing that the Old Testament priesthood was now obsolete. We can now come directly to God through the great high priest that is Jesus. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Hebrews 4:14 through 16. Guys, there are now no earthly mediators between God and man as existed in that Old Testament priesthood. As 1 Timothy 2:5 says, "For there is one God, and there is one mediator between God and men, the man, Jesus Christ." But Jesus didn't just destroy that old covenant way of doing things with the earthly priests and the man-made temple. You see, Jesus actually made something new. "Tear down this temple," Jesus said, "and in 3 days I will raise it up." What was Jesus talking about here? Well, one of Jesus' closest followers answers this question for us. "You also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, His own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light." 1 Peter 2:5 and 9. Friends, all faithful followers of Jesus are of that holy priesthood. And no person on earth has the right to assume the old covenant priestly role. No one can forbid you from going directly to God through Christ. All Christ followers are now a royal priesthood with one great high priest, and that is Jesus. Hebrews 10:19 through 22 says, "We have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain. Since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings." So what does the priesthood of all believers mean then? Well, it means that we all stand equally before God. Now, this equal standing doesn't negate specific giftedness or calling. Rather, it enhances our giftedness as each one of us does our part to build the body. We are all priests, and we are all responsible. We all have a part to play. So let's frame our answer to what is the priesthood of all believers within the framework of relationship and responsibility. Relationship. We all have been given direct access to God through Jesus. Responsibility. We all have a shared calling to be ministers. Now we've answered the question, what is the priesthood of all believers? But I want you to begin asking yourself, why does it matter? In the 1500s, the Protestant Reformation did a great deal to restore the New Covenant realization that all believers are considered part of the royal priesthood. And in his address to the nobility of the German nation in 1520, Luther criticized the traditional distinction between temporal and spiritual, the laity and the clergy. He argued that all who belonged to Christ shared in the priesthood of Jesus Christ, and they belonged to the spiritual estate. Luther taught that we all have direct access to God through Christ. Now, this was breakthrough teaching in its day, and it stood in stark contrast, even opposition, to the Catholic clergy-dominated system that required priests to administer the grace of God and obtain mercy for the people. But though this was a really great start, I don't think that the Reformers took it quite far enough, honestly. They did make some really wonderful theological declarations, but they still maintained the clergy-laity distinction. It was a system that only allowed specific ordained men to perform significant ministry and leadership in the church, and this continued. Very plainly said, they believed the right stuff, but they just didn't do enough about it. There was a gap between what they said and what they did. Well, why was this? Well, as you study the Reformers, you'll see a concern arise in their writings that the priesthood of all believers would lead to uncontrolled private judgments, subjectivism and eccentricity and anarchy and chaos, as Calvin put it. Basically, they were worried that people were going to get weird. But here the Bible isn't silent. Hebrews actually speaks clearly on the priesthood of all believers. And then in the same breath, it tells us to encourage and to challenge one another and not to forsake being in community with each other. This is a picture of a church that listens to the Lord together, that affirms each other's Spirit-given gifts, and that encourages each other toward Christ. You see, the solution to these concerns isn't found in implementing hierarchical systems of control or positional systems of status. The solution is found through committed, loving community. You know, as I've shared these things with others in the past, some folks have gotten pretty anxious. The priesthood of all believers and flattening the hierarchy all sound well and good, but are you advocating for anarchy here? Are you anti-leadership, Joe? And the answer to all the above is no. Absence of leadership is not the solution to unbiblical leadership. We just might need to reimagine what we've come to believe leadership needs to be. We might need to go back and look at what Jesus himself had to say about it and what the New Testament church modeled. And in our next session, you're invited to explore this with me. But avoid the idea that we're inventing something new, because this is more about returning to the root than anything else. This is really about rediscovering something ancient and forgotten that's just waiting to be awakened once more. But tonight I close by inviting you into a discussion. And my question to you is this: if what you've just heard about the priesthood of all believers is true, then what are the implications for real life for us as the church?